Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following story is part of the Mayhem Cerebrum project, linked to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request.
Well, if you haven't figured out why this story is important yet, I think this episode will help you out. These first two stories have been the longest I've written for Mayhem Cerebrum so far. They are the only stories that are over 2 parts. So it's going to get a little more consumable from here, but these 2 stories were very important for me to get out first. And I'm very excited to conclude this one. I don't know if it's going to end the way people imagine it ending. We'll have to see. So without further ado, here is Juno's Been Had, Part 3. He looked so normal, sitting there in the interrogation room. Alex watched him from behind the one-way mirror, brows furrowed. It had been the longest 24 hours of her life. Just getting him to the police station had been an ordeal. She'd had to tase him again on the drive over, and that was after spending a nerve-wracking 10 minutes waiting for police backup. After that, she'd gotten minimal sleep before heading over to the video store the next morning, warrant in hand. Sure enough, the body of Andrei Kreminski was immediately discovered locked up in a supply closet. Even if he couldn't be charged with all the other crimes he committed, at least he'd go down for that one. The problem was Andrew. After everything she'd seen last night, Alex was convinced that he and Mr. Malum were 2 entirely different individuals, but it wasn't like she'd ever be able to write that down in a report. For all intents and purposes, it was Andrew who committed those crimes. An innocent man was going to be punished for the rest of his life for crimes that he didn't commit. But Alex wasn't going to let his sacrifice go to waste. The way she saw it, she had one more shot to figure out who exactly this fucker was. If she did, maybe she could stop something like this from happening again. She just had to make sure she didn't look crazy in the process. "I gotta say," said the officer next to her with a somewhat pitying expression, "he really doesn't look like a murderer to me. Kinda reminds me of my nephew. Sweet kid. Guess it just goes to show you can't trust anybody, huh?" "Mr. Zeng's a bit of a special case." She tried to sound as authoritative as possible. "It's undiagnosed, so I can't say for sure, but I believe he has a pretty straightforward case of dissociative identity disorder." "Huh?" "A split personality. It tends to occur as the result of some sort of trauma, which tracks considering his background. This second personality calls itself Mr. Malum, and it seems to contain all of his violent thoughts and tendencies which he potentially inherited from his father." She felt sick to her stomach placing all this on him, but odds were she was already being recorded before she even entered the room. "He's pretty lucky. Some cases contain 4, 5, even more personalities than that sometimes. And this sicko will only speak to you, huh?" Alex bit her lip to stop herself from saying something. "It makes sense," she said instead. "I'm the one who's been tracking him down, after all." "So what are you gonna do?" "Play along," Alex sighed. "If there's any more victims, this will be the best way to learn about them. But if I deny the fantasy he's built for himself, he might become agitated. Like a bull in a china store." "Pretty much, yep." Taking a deep breath, Alex steeled herself for what was to come. She had no idea who she was going to meet in there. Whoever it was, she had to make this count. The door slammed behind her with a heavy clunk, and Andrew glanced upwards. A broad grin spread across his face. "There you are, Daisy Chain. Took you long enough." Well, at least he didn't leave her guessing for long. "I heard you wouldn't speak to anyone else." He barked out a laugh. "As if you could stay away." Trying to ignore the feeling of her skin itself trying to crawl away, Alex sat down at the table across from him. The light was so harsh that it was hurting her eyes. She had no idea how he'd sat here for hours. "I'm surprised you haven't broken out yet," she commented. "After what you did to my gun yesterday, those handcuffs should be nothing." "You don't listen very well, do you?" Just as Alex took out a pencil to take some notes, she felt it jostle between her fingers and giggle at her. She dropped it onto the table, but when she blinked, it lay still. Just a normal pencil again. "You said you weren't at your best, but what does that mean?" "That's the extent of what I can do at the moment. Pathetic, ain't it? I used up all my juice last night. If you had knocked Andrew out for so long, you might have been talking to him right now instead. So you're stuck. For a while, at least. Then we've got time. He looked at her curiously, tilting his head. Funny, he said. I thought you'd be asking me more about the things I've done. I don't need to, she said. One murder is more than enough to lock you away for a very long time. But if you want to confess to any of the other crimes in Andrew Zeng's file, then I certainly wouldn't be opposed. Ah, so you know about all that already. He leaned forward, at least as far as the handcuffs would allow. The expression on his face wasn't unnatural per se, but it wasn't one Andrew would have ever made. Too giddy. Too confident. It unnerved her. But there's something that you know nothing about. And what's that? Me. He'd hit the nail right on the head. Mr. Malum laughed as he saw he was right. Tell you what, for old time's sake, let's you and me play a little game. I don't like your games, she scowled. No tricks this time, he insisted. The game is simple. We each get to ask the other 3 questions. You have to answer truthfully. I'll be able to tell if you're lying. That's it? She asked. I don't get it. I get some questions answered, but what do you get out of this whole thing? Is that your first question? I haven't agreed to play yet. Fine. He tilted his head playfully. It's to cause Andrew pain. Alex glared at him silently for a minute. I'll even let you go first, he offered. All right, she said finally. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she blurted, What are you? You certainly don't waste any time, he scoffed. Now, how can I word this without blowing your feeble little mind? Let's see. I'm not from around here. I'm from somewhere outside, though even there I'm a bit of an anomaly. There are a few of us, but I'm a bit special. He fell silent, staring at her. Care to elaborate? She asked. I answered your question. We never said how. I was entirely truthful. Of course, he'd try to pull some carefully worded genie bullshit on her. She'd have to be more cautious about what she asked. Then I guess that makes it your turn. It certainly is. He sat back. Okie dokie, my first question is, just how long have you been trying to track us down? Since I went back to the lake. So, 7 years then. 7 years of sleepless nights and shitty coffee just for one loser you knew for 2 months when you were 13? That's not my second question, by the way. The right side of his face twitched momentarily into a sort of grimace, and Alex definitely didn't miss it. It timed out perfectly with a pang of guilt that hit her own chest. Malum was devious. If pain was his goal, he was getting 2 for the price of 1. Which makes it your turn. Alex paused, thinking carefully. Ultimately, what he was or where he was from didn't matter so much. What was most important was how much of a threat he was. If you're so special as you claim, then how come I've been able to beat you not once, but twice now? He raised one side of his upper lip in agitation. Because I'm so special that I was going to control the entire cosmos. Your gun, that pencil, the speakers, that's all a tiny micro-fraction of what I can do out there. But some people are afraid of change, of creation, so they locked me up. Most of me is still back there now. Maybe it was the sheer unbelievability of it all, but Alex found her brain glossing over some of the more incredulous implications. But she had to learn something important. That it was definitely a good thing she'd gotten him behind bars again. All right, my second question. Mr. Malum interrupted her thoughtful silence. Did you think before our reacquaintance, that is, that Andrew did it? All the murder, the mayhem and such, I mean? She knew what he was really asking. Whether she believed that Mr. Malum was a real, separate entity, or if Andrew had just lost his mind. Alex wanted to say no. She desperately wanted to say that she'd believed in Andrew for all those years spent looking for him. Yes, she said, after a very long pause. Then she looked away at the floor. She didn't want to see the hurt that no doubt momentarily passed over his features. That's what I figured. Her head shot up again in shock, as for just a moment she was sure that Andrew would come back. But when he saw the look on her face, Mr. Malum laughed, and Alex turned red with frustration. One final question, he intoned.
Better make it count.
Though she would never admit it, he'd gotten to her a bit, and in her agitation, Alex was a little hasty. I don't understand, she said. If you're locked up, as you say, then how are you talking to me right now?
In case you couldn't tell,
he rolled his eyes as if this was the most obvious thing in the world.
I'm not made of flesh and blood like you are. I'm malleable. All I needed to start sneaking out was an anchor, or two, and a conduit.
Conduit?
They took everything from the kids' pockets when they locked me up in here, so you must have seen it, right? I can't imagine you missed it.
Alex shivered as she realized what he was talking about. Of course she'd seen it when she'd pawed through the evidence not an hour ago. Mr. Malum held up his palm, Andrew's palm, and showed her a scar. It was a perfect imprint. It exactly matched that strange key currently in a vacuum-sealed plastic bag in the evidence locker. He'd kept it. All these years, Andrew had kept that key. If he'd just thrown it away, back at the cave, then maybe none of this would have happened. Unless he hadn't had a choice. No, Malum was just trying to confuse her again, trying to get in her head. She had to remain steady. She still had to get through his last question.
All right, let's bring it home with a classic, for old time's sake.
Alex's heart sank. She knew where this was going. Mr. Malum grinned, sensing her discomfort.
How do you feel about Andrew?
He waited, his expression frozen in that ice-cold smile, as Alex sat in silence.
By all means, take your time, he said. Although I would think carefully if I were you. It'd be disappointing for everyone if you copped out like last time.
I hate him. She spat, surprising herself just as much as Mr. Malum.
Huh?
I hate him for his weakness, but I love him for his strength. She didn't really know what she was saying, but she kept going anyway. I'm so angry at him for being such an idiot, and I'm devastated at how much he's had to endure all on his own for all these years. I pity him, and I'm proud of him, but most of all, I'm scared of him. I'm terrified of what he might have become after a decade of you. Asking me to put it in one word, one emotion, is ridiculous. Feelings are more complicated than that. They always are. For once, Mr. Malum said nothing. He just stared at her in stunned silence, though an odd look was slowly crossing his face. Was it confusion? But she wasn't going to give him a chance to express it. Now, I believe that concludes your little game, doesn't it? So if you'll excuse me, I think we're done here. Without another word, she got up and walked out of the room. Alex hadn't left town when she got the call. She'd been sitting in her hotel room, in the dark, not quite sure what to do with herself. She was paralyzed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Hello?" she asked, not even bothering to check who it was. There was silence for so long that she was just about to hang up. But then he spoke.
"Alex?"
She tried to speak, but her throat was stuck closed.
No, there's nothing I can say to convince you. It's actually me.
He had one phone call. He only had one, and he'd used it to call her, the woman who had ruined his life. "I'm sorry," she stuttered out. Even if this was another trick, she needed to say it and hope that he could hear. He laughed, but it was so quiet and bitter, so different from that near cackle that even now was echoing in her ears. And it was that moment that she became sure. It was him.
I think that's my line.
Andrew.
This is going to sound so fake.
He sighed.
After everything, and I know that it's stupid and dumb and selfish, but I want to see you. One last time.
He was about to spend a lifetime in prison for a series of crimes he didn't commit, and she was the one who'd put him there. It would cause her more pain, especially if Mr. Malum made another appearance. But she owed him this. After 10 years, they were finally going to make it out of that damned cave. The holding cell was made of concrete. Andrew was the only one in it. Worse, it was raining again. Not that he would really be able to hear it, but it left the air feeling damp. Once again, it was damnably familiar. Alex didn't have much time. Her boss had realized where she was. Obviously she had, after the reports started coming in about the murder and Alex's involvement therein. Her phone had been ringing off the hook for the last 20 minutes. Once this was done, Alex would face whatever consequences awaited her. But right now, she had one last thing she needed to do. He was sitting at the back of the cell, collapsed on a metal bench, head leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. He only stirred when the heavy metal door closed behind her. Andrew looked exhausted, though no doubt she looked exactly the same. Blearily, he blinked at her a few times as she approached the bars. "You came," he said, with a mixture of relief and disappointment that sent horrible aches through her chest. "Of course," she whispered. "I had to, didn't I? It's my fault. All of it. I should have made sure that he was really gone way back when. If I had, then maybe I was tricked. I'm such an idiot." "We were both tricked," he said, his voice stronger than she was expecting. "But me worst of all. None of this is on you, so stop apologizing. This is all me." "You can't really believe that, you Alex." He cut her off. "I kept it." "What?" "That fucking key. He didn't force me to. Even after I saw what he did, I kept it. I was just a dumbass little kid who saw your life and I wanted to be enough to fit in it." She didn't know what she could say to that. "You should have been a lawyer," he said, "or a doctor, or a fucking astronaut. But because of me, I dragged you down into the mud with me." "You're still a dumbass," she muttered. "Huh? You think you're really important? Like I didn't choose this for myself? I guess if there's one silver lining to all of this, it's thanks to you that I found something I love doing more than anything. Only thing I could really blame you for is making me lose it after all of this is said and done. Sorry about that. You shouldn't have kept it, though. I know. I wish you'd realize that it didn't matter," she sighed. "You didn't need to be anything more than you already were." He hung his head, and for a moment Alex thought he was thinking. But then, his shoulders began to shake. Gradually, the sound reached her ears. Laughter. Andrew's head shot up suddenly and jerked to one side with an audible crack. "Well, isn't this just touching?" Mr. Malum grinned. "It's so saccharine it makes me want to barf." Alex was just about to scowl, but then he suddenly squeezed his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, his expression changed drastically. "Shit, not now," he begged through gritted teeth. "Just let me say goodbye, you bastard. Is that too much to ask?" His head jerked again. "Sorry, kid. No can do. You see, this lady friend of yours and I have some unfinished business." I thought it was pretty conclusive myself. Alex did scowl now. "Leave her alone, please," Andrew pleaded. "Why are you so obsessed with her?" "Maybe it's because you are. I've got no clue, but I gotta say, Daisy Chain." He'd been talking back and forth to himself, but suddenly turned back to Alex. "I didn't expect you to actually get me in the end. But once again, you surprised me, and then, cherry right on top of the cake, you proved to be so much more entertaining than I expected, even after your victory. I might be just as smitten with you as the kid is." "Then why don't you leave him alone and come bug me instead?" "Alex! You don't know how much I wish I could. Alas, good old Andrew is the only one who fits right. Until he's dead, I'm stuck with him, the loser. But just killing him would be too easy." "What are you planning? I doubt you're just going to spend the next 60 years in prison." "Not in this one, at least." He stood and took a few stumbling steps towards the bars in between them. I'm sorry, Andrew said, his voice rising. I'm so sorry. I can't do anything. He's trying to pull something. Please, Alex, get out of here. But before Alex could heed his warning, one of his arms shot out and grabbed her through those bars with a vice-like grip.
But if I must return to my true prison, I won't go alone this time. I want to see you struggle more.
What are you doing? She demanded, struggling to get away, but he wrenched her arm back through to his side so that her shoulder was pinned. Grinning, he raised his palm upward, the one with the key-shaped scar, and it began to glow. It doesn't matter what you do to me, Alex shouted over the sudden roaring sound and a rush of wind. I'll destroy you and free Andrew. She wanted to say more, but the very air itself was twisting and distorting around her, sapping the oxygen from her lungs. Yet somehow, through the cacophony, she could hear his voice so clearly.
That sounds like fun. Promise.